And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Okay, marine forecast here for the south coast of the Panhandle. East to southeast winds tomorrow 20 to 25 knots. And for the north coast, east winds 15 to 30 knots. North at 20 for Lynn Canal Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage. Winds southeast at 20 for Clarence Strait. And then for the day on Friday for Prince William Sound, north winds at 10 knots. Northeast winds 15 to 20 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. And north to northeast for Cook Inlet, Friday at 20 to 25 knots. Gale warnings for Kamishak Bay, northwest 35 knot winds, and north at 30 for the Barren Islands. And for Saturday for Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots, northwest 30 knots for Kamishak Bay, and north at 30 knots for the Barren Islands. Prince William Sound, northeast at 10. Eastern North Gulf Coast, looking at northeast winds at 15 knots. And moving down to Kodiak Island for Friday, north winds 25 to 30 knots, and a pretty windy day coming up for the Alaska Peninsula. North to northwest winds 30 to 40 knots with gusts of 50 knots out of some bays there on the Pacific side. Bristol Bay north at 25 knots. And for Saturday, winds come down here for the peninsula, but don't end altogether. Still northwest 20 to 30 knots. Northwest at 20 for Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, north at 25 to 30 knots. For the eastern Aleutians, on Friday, north winds 25 to 35 knots, much lighter for the central Aleutians, north at 15 knots, and out west, southeast winds 20 knots. And then for the western Aleutians, Saturday, south winds 25 to 30 knots, Adak and Atka looking at northwest winds at 20 knots, and northwest 25 to 30 knot winds for the Fox Islands. And for the southwest coast, tomorrow, northwest winds 15 to 30 knots, northwest at 15, St. Lawrence Island, 10 knots for Norton Sound, west at 20 for St. Matthew Island and the Pribilofs, northerly winds 20 knots, seas 6 feet. And then for Saturday, Norton Sound, pretty light winds from the south at 10 knots. And for St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta coast, west at 15 knots, northwest 20 south of Nunivak Island. Same thing for the Pribilof Islands. But St. Matthew Island, southwest winds 30 knots with seas at 14 feet. And up for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, actually the entire Arctic coast, looking at east winds tomorrow at 15 to 20 knots. And the Chukchi Sea, light variable winds 5 to 10 knots. For Saturday, with that system coming across from the west there, these winds for the Chukchi Sea increase to the from south to southeast at 20 to 30 knots. Central and western Arctic coast, southeast winds 20 knots. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, winds will be east at 15 to 30 knots.